sooner we'll be done.
And if you don't love him, I don't think you really know how to love.
She would later be called the Queen of Gospel, a voice so powerful it could still a room, move a nation, and shake the walls of history itself. But before the records, before the marches, before the White House invitations and the thunderous applause, Mahalia Jackson was just a poor black girl growing up where survival came before dreams. Her story doesn't begin on a stage. It begins in struggle. Mahalia Jackson was born on October 26, 1911, in New Orleans, Louisiana, into a world that offered very little mercy to black families. Her father was absent from her life, and she was raised primarily by her mother, Charity Clark, surrounded by extended family members who were still carrying the trauma of slavery in their bloodlines. Her grandparents had been born enslaved. Their memories shaped the household. Stories of endurance, discipline, and faith passed down like survival manuals. They lived near the Mississippi River levee in a small, leaky house where rain didn't stop at the roof. It came inside. 13 people crowded under one roof, sharing space, food, and hardship. There was love, but there was also strict control, especially after tragedy struck early. Mahalia's mother died when she was still a child. That loss changed everything. After her mother's passing, Mahalia was taken in by her aunt, known as Duke, a woman described as harsh, quick-tempered, and uncompromising. Life under her roof was rigid. Mahalia spent her days scrubbing floors, doing laundry, and performing endless chores. Mistakes were punished quickly. Comfort was rare, but there was one place where Mahalia could breathe: the church. Mount Moriah Baptist Church became her refuge. Her grandfather preached there, and from the moment Mahalia stepped inside, she felt something different. The music wasn't just sound, it was release. The hymns weren't just songs, they were survival tools. When she joined the junior choir at just 12 years old, people noticed immediately. Her voice didn't sound like a child's voice. It sounded lived in, heavy with emotion, carrying pain, faith, and hope all at once. By her teenage years, Mahalia's physical struggles began to fade. As a child, she had suffered from bowed legs that earned her cruel nicknames, but by 14, her legs had straightened. Home life, however, remained unbearable. Arguments with her aunt grew violent and unpredictable. On more than one occasion, Mahalia was thrown out of the house, forced to sleep with relatives or friends. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. Her family decided she needed a fresh start, and they sent her north. When Mahalia arrived in Chicago, she didn't arrive as a singer chasing fame. She arrived as a young woman trying to survive. She dreamed of becoming a nurse or a teacher, but reality had other plans. She worked exhausting jobs, laundries, factories, long hours for little pay. Her hands were raw, her body was tired, but her voice never stopped. She sang everywhere: churches, community gatherings, any place that would let her stand and lift her voice. She used to say she was a fish and bread singer, someone who sang to feed both the body and the soul. Singing wasn't about celebrity, it was about staying alive. It was in Chicago that fate stepped in. Mahalia crossed paths with Thomas A. Dorsey, a former blues musician who had turned to gospel after personal tragedy. Dorsey immediately recognized what others hadn't fully understood yet. Mahalia didn't just sing gospel music, she embodied it. He taught her to slow down, to let silence breathe, to let pain linger in a note until it reached the listener's chest. Together, they performed on street corners and in small churches, selling sheet music for pennies. They barely scraped by, but something extraordinary was happening without them realizing it. They were shaping a new sound, blending the emotional weight of blues with the spiritual fire of gospel. Mahalia didn't sing to entertain, she sang to move people. She used to say her goal was to wreck a church. Not physically, but spiritually, to shake people so deeply that they felt touched by something higher. She refused offers to sing secular music, refused theaters, refused anything that felt like compromise. She made a promise to God early on that she would never use her voice for anything other than gospel, and she kept that promise for the rest of her life. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Mahalia Jackson was no longer just another singer in Chicago. She was becoming something else entirely, a force. But the world had no idea what was coming next, because the voice that rose from poverty, grief, and faith was about to change American music forever, and this was only the beginning. When Mahalia Jackson's voice began to rise above the crowded churches of Chicago, it wasn't because the world suddenly became ready for her. It was because she refused to shrink herself to fit anyone else's expectations. Chicago in the 1930s was loud, divided, and unforgiving, especially for a young black woman with no money, no formal training, and no safety net. Mahalia worked brutal hours as a laundress seamstress and factory worker, scrubbing clothes and lifting heavy loads just to survive. By the time Sunday came, her body was exhausted, but her spirit was alive. Singing wasn't a hobby for her, it was oxygen. She called herself a fish and bread singer, meaning she sang to survive, not to impress. Every note was meant to feed her body and her soul. It was during these years that she crossed paths with Thomas A. Dorsey, a former blues musician who had turned toward gospel after deep personal tragedy. Dorsey heard something in Mahalia that went beyond talent. He heard truth. He began coaching her, teaching her how to slow down, how to let silence do some of the work, how to let emotion carry the song instead of rushing through it. Together, they began performing wherever they could. Street corners, church basements, small halls with folding chairs and bad acoustics. Sometimes Dorsey would hand her lyrics scribbled on paper, and Mahalia would build the melody on the spot, pulling it out of instinct and faith. They sold sheet music for a few cents at a time, barely enough to eat, but what they were creating was revolutionary. Without trying to, they were shaping a new sound, blending the emotional depth of blues with the spiritual power of gospel. It was raw, expressive, and deeply human. Mahalia's mission was simple. She wanted to move people. She used to say she wanted to wreck a church, not in chaos, but in feeling. She wanted people crying, shouting, praying, and leaving changed. Even as the Great Depression tightened its grip, she kept going. She sang at funerals, rallies, conventions, anywhere someone would listen. Money was scarce, but her belief never wavered. At the same time, she made a promise that would define her career forever. After her grandfather suffered a stroke, she prayed for his recovery and vowed that if he lived, she would never sing secular music or perform in theaters. When he recovered, she kept her word. No matter how much record labels pressured her to cross over, no matter how much money was offered, Mahalia refused. Gospel was not a stepping stone for her, it was the destination. As the years passed, she saved enough money to open a beauty salon in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. It wasn't just a business, it became a gathering place. Singers, musicians, neighbors, and friends came through, sharing meals, stories, and songs. Mahalia cooked big, comforting dishes and sang while she worked, her voice filling the room like a blessing. The salon gave her stability and independence, something rare for Black women at the time. Her life changed again during a performance in Harlem, when a talent scout from Apollo Records heard her sing. The label wanted to break into gospel music and signed her to a modest deal. The early records didn't sell well, and executives quickly grew impatient. They suggested she switch to blues, to something more commercial. Mahalia refused without hesitation. She would rather fail than betray her calling. One last chance was all she was given. For that session, she recorded a song she often used to warm up before concerts. Move On Up a Little Higher. No one expected much, but when the record was released in 1947, it exploded. Tens of thousands of copies sold in Chicago alone, then hundreds of thousands nationwide. Eventually, it sold in the millions, an unheard of achievement for a gospel song. Overnight, Mahalia Jackson became a national sensation. Churches filled beyond capacity. Concert halls that had never welcomed gospel before opened their doors. Her voice, powerful and unfiltered, cut through racial and cultural lines. Invitations poured in from across the country, even from political figures. Yet fame demanded sacrifice. She stepped away from her local church duties and sold her salon to focus entirely on music. Her influence soon crossed the ocean. In Europe, audiences embraced her like royalty, drawn to the emotion in her voice even if they didn't fully understand the words. But success also brought betrayal. Contracts expired without her knowledge. Earnings were mishandled. Once again, Mahalia found herself forced to rebuild. That rebuilding led to a new chapter. A major label offered her a groundbreaking deal, making her the first gospel singer to receive that level of recognition. The pressure to soften her message and appeal to wider audiences returned, but Mahalia stood firm. Gospel was her truth, and she would not let anyone rewrite it. By the end of this chapter of her life, Mahalia Jackson was no longer just a church singer or a local star. She was a national voice carrying faith, pain, and resilience into every room she entered. But the road ahead would test her in ways no applause ever could. By the early 1960s, Mahalia Jackson's voice was no longer just famous. It was historic. She had become more than a singer. She was a spiritual force, a cultural anchor, and for millions of Black Americans, a living symbol of dignity in a country still defined by segregation and violence. While many entertainers carefully avoided politics to protect their careers, Mahalia made a different choice. She believed faith without action was empty, and music without purpose was hollow. Her closest friendship reflected that belief. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a public ally. He was family. They spoke often, prayed together, and relied on one another during moments of exhaustion and doubt. Mahalia believed in King's vision not because it was popular, but because it aligned with the gospel she had been singing since childhood. To her, civil rights were not politics, they were a moral obligation. She used her voice exactly where it mattered most. When activists were jailed, she raised bail money. When organizers were threatened, she sang at fundraisers. When movements needed strength, she showed up, often quietly, without press. Her presence alone could shift the energy in a room. Ministers said that when Mahalia sang before a rally, people stood taller. They felt braver. Her most iconic moment came on August 28, 1963, at the March on Washington. More than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. Mahalia stood before them and sang, "I've been bucked and I've been scorned," her voice carrying generations of pain, followed by "How I Got Over," a declaration of survival. The crowd was already moved, but history had one more turn to take. As Dr. King began his prepared speech, Mahalia sensed something was missing. The words were powerful, but restrained. From behind him, she called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." King looked up, set his notes aside, and began to speak freely. What followed became one of the most famous speeches in human history. Mahalia later said she knew the moment would matter forever. She had seen that fire in church before. She recognized it instantly. After King's assassination in 1968, Mahalia was devastated. His death left a silence she never fully recovered from. Yet even in grief, she continued singing, believing that her responsibility was now greater than ever. "God don't need nothing," she once said, "but people need each other." That belief guided her through the later years of her life. Behind the public triumphs, her private world was growing heavier. Her health had been fragile since childhood, and years of nonstop touring took their toll. She suffered from sarcoidosis, a chronic inflammatory disease that affected her lungs and later her heart. By the mid-1960s, she was frequently exhausted, short of breath, and in pain. But she rarely slowed down. Singing was not just her profession, it was her calling. Her second marriage to Sigmund Galloway initially brought comfort, but quickly turned toxic. As Mahalia's health declined, the relationship deteriorated. Arguments over money and control became common. Galloway tried to insert himself into her business affairs, despite having no experience. When the marriage turned abusive, Mahalia ended it decisively. She filed for divorce, endured public scrutiny, and walked away without bitterness. She had learned long ago that peace was worth more than appearances. Despite illness and personal loss, Mahalia remained deeply generous. Her Chicago home became a refuge for friends, musicians, ministers, and strangers alike. Her phone number was listed publicly, and people called constantly, asking for help, advice, or simply comfort. She answered when she could. She cooked massive meals, paid tuition for students, and quietly supported families in need. She believed her success only mattered if it was shared. Even as her strength faded, her standards never did. On tour, she personally counted audiences to ensure fair payment. She demanded respect not just for herself, but for every black performer who would come after her. She refused to be exploited even when she was tired, especially when she was tired. By the late 1960s, Mahalia Jackson had given nearly everything she had to the world. Her voice had carried movements, healed spirits, and reshaped American culture. Yet the cost was undeniable. Her body was worn, her heart was fragile, and the end of her journey was approaching, quietly, without drama, but with the same dignity that defined her life. What remained was not just a legacy of music, but a blueprint for courage. How to rise without abandoning your roots, how to serve without losing yourself, and how to stand firm in faith even when the world pushes back. In the final chapter of her life, Mahalia Jackson would face her greatest test, not on a stage, but in silence. By the late 1960s, Mahalia Jackson had already given the world everything it would ever associate with her name, a voice that carried faith, courage, and dignity through the darkest chapters of American history. But behind the reverence, the awards, and the standing ovations, her body was quietly failing her. Years of relentless touring, emotional strain, and untreated illness had taken their toll. Mahalia suffered from sarcoidosis, a chronic inflammatory disease that affected her lungs and eventually spread to her heart. She lived with constant fatigue, shortness of breath, high blood pressure, and recurring chest pain. Doctors warned her to slow down, to rest, to protect what little strength she had left. But Mahalia had never learned how to stop. Even as her health declined, she continued to perform whenever she could, driven by a belief that her voice was not hers to keep. She saw it as a gift from God, one she was obligated to use for as long as breath remained in her body. Friends worried, doctors pleaded. Mahalia listened politely, and then kept singing. Her personal life during these final years offered little peace. Her marriage to Sigmund Galloway, which began quickly and hopefully, deteriorated just as fast. Instead of support, the relationship became marked by arguments, control, and emotional volatility. Mahalia, already physically weakened, found herself drained emotionally as well. Eventually, the marriage ended in divorce after public court proceedings that exposed painful private details. Though hurt and humiliated, Mahalia emerged resolute. She refused to let bitterness define her final chapter. Those close to her said she never spoke ill of Galloway afterward. Instead, she turned inward, back toward faith, service, and quiet generosity. Despite everything, Mahalia remained deeply committed to the civil rights movement until the very end. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 devastated her. She mourned him not only as a leader, but as a brother in spirit. She sang at his funeral, her voice trembling but steady, carrying grief that mirrored the pain of an entire nation. After King's death, Mahalia withdrew slightly from public life. The world felt heavier. The fight felt lonelier. Still, she continued to help where she could, paying tuition for students, supporting churches, feeding anyone who came to her door. Her phone number remained listed publicly, and she answered nearly every call. Her Chicago home, located at 8358 South Indiana Avenue, became the center of her final years and a symbol of everything she had endured and overcome. The red brick house in the Chatham neighborhood was more than a residence. It was a sanctuary. Buying that home in the 1950s had been an act of quiet defiance. At the time, Chatham was a predominantly white neighborhood, and black families were actively discouraged and threatened from moving in. When Mahalia purchased the house, the backlash was immediate. Protest meetings were held, anonymous callers issued threats. One night, bullets were fired through her windows. For nearly a year, police officers guarded the property. Mahalia refused to leave. "I just wanted a quiet home," she said. Over time, her presence changed the neighborhood itself. What was once hostile became proud. Chatham eventually grew into one of Chicago's most stable and respected black communities, and Mahalia Jackson's home stood at the center of that transformation. Inside the house, Mahalia lived simply. A piano in the living room, a kitchen that always smelled of food, a dining table that rarely sat empty. Ministers, musicians, activists, and strangers all passed through those doors. She fed them all. As her health worsened in 1971, Mahalia canceled appearances and entered the hospital multiple times. In January 1972, after surgery for a bowel obstruction, her condition suddenly deteriorated. On January 27, 1972, Mahalia Jackson passed away in Chicago at the age of 60. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Her funeral at Greater Salem Baptist Church drew more than 50,000 mourners, many standing in freezing temperatures just to be present. Gospel singers filled the sanctuary. Her voice, recorded and replayed, echoed through the church one final time. A second memorial at McCormick Place drew thousands more, including political leaders, civil rights figures, and artists from across the world. Her body was then returned to New Orleans, where over 60,000 people filed past her casket as she lay in state. The girl who once sang barefoot in church now rested as a national treasure. At the time of her death, Mahalia Jackson left behind an estate valued at approximately $4 million, equivalent to more than $24 million today. For a woman born into poverty, raised by formerly enslaved grandparents, and committed exclusively to gospel music, it was a remarkable achievement. Her will reflected who she was. Much of her wealth went to family members, particularly nieces and nephews. She also left money to her church and to scholarship funds supporting young black students, ensuring that her legacy would continue not just in song, but in opportunity. Today, Mahalia Jackson's home still stands. It is quiet now. No police outside, no threats, no crowds, just a house that once held a woman who changed music, faith, and history without ever compromising who she was. Mahalia Jackson did not chase fame. She did not bend to trends. She did not trade her calling for comfort. She sang when it was dangerous. She stood when it was lonely. She gave when she had every excuse to protect herself instead. Her voice helped fuel the civil rights movement. Her courage helped reshape neighborhoods. Her faith helped millions endure pain they could not put into words. Mahalia Jackson was not just the queen of gospel. She was proof that conviction can outlive fear, that faith can move nations, and that a life rooted in purpose leaves echoes long after the final note fades. And that is why her story still matters.